Hello friends, welcome to Lost Scrolls Archive, a basement room in a large museum, not a public gallery with labels and lighting, a storage vault, the kind where the things too old, too fragile, or too poorly understood to be put on display, are kept instead in flat wooden trays, each object wrapped in acid-free tissue and recorded with a small paper tag. The air is dry and carefully controlled. The temperature does not change from season to season. The shelves go back further than the light reaches comfortably. A researcher is working alone at a long table. She is not looking for anything in particular. She is cataloging a slow, methodical process of picking up one fragment, recording its measurements, its condition, the existing literature on it, and setting it gently back in its tray. A routine task, the kind that takes months and produces little that is dramatic or headline-worthy. She reaches for a piece roughly the size of a human hand, palm-sized, baked the color of pale sand by 4,000 years of time. It is inscribed on both faces and along one edge with columns of tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay when it was still soft form, the oldest writing system in the recorded world. The marks are small, but clearly formed, the work of a scribe who knew exactly what the hand must do. She has seen hundreds of these, thousands. They do not startle her, but as she reads the columns, as she works her way down the list inscribed in the first section of the tablet, she pauses. Then she reads it again. The text is a god list, a formal enumeration of divine beings, in hierarchical order, the kind that Mesopotamian scribes compiled with bureaucratic precision across centuries. God lists are among the most common genres of kind-form literature. They are not, as a rule, surprising. What she's looking at is a section from a composition scholars call Anakhanum, the great Babylonian divine catalogue that assembled older Sumerian traditions into a single organized sequence. The tablet preserves the opening section of the text, dedicated to the god Enlil, one of the most powerful and well-known figures in the Sumerian pantheon. And at the head of that section, before Enlil is named, before his known companions and attendants are listed, before anything that resembles the familiar structure of Sumerian divine hierarchy appears, there is a list of names, 21 pairs of male and female, paired with meticulous symmetry. Lord and Lady of the Earth, Lord and Lady of Ancient Time, Lord and Lady of the Holy Hill, Lord and Lady of the Countless Divine Decrees. The names go on pair after pair, each one translating into a concept that precedes the world as the Sumerians knew it. And at the very bottom of the sequence, as if they have been generated by what came before, as if they are the product rather than the origin, Enlil and Ninlil appear at last. The known gods come last. The unknown beings come first. This is not a fringe text. It is not a later corruption or a scribal error. It is confirmed across multiple independent tablet traditions, inscribed in temple libraries, copied in scribal schools, invoked in exorcism rituals, and military oaths, and royal hymns, across more than 2,000 years of continuous Mesopotamian civilization. Whatever these 21 pairs represent, the Sumerians clearly considered them real enough, ancient enough, and important enough to place them at the beginning of everything. And they predate the Anunnaki. That is the question this investigation intends to follow. Not to answer it with certainty. There are no certain answers to questions this old. But the cuneiform record, when read carefully, when followed across different genres, and different centuries, and different sites of excavation, contains something that scholars have documented thoroughly, and general audiences have rarely encountered. It contains what appears to be a consistent multi-source tradition describing a strait of beings, or a state of existence, that preceded the gods the Sumerians are famous for. Before An, before Enlil, before Enki, before the Anunnaki decreed the fates of humanity, something was here. The tablets say so in lists, in hymns, in flood accounts, in royal chronicles, in ritual incantation series, in military treaties sworn before the most powerful witnesses a Sumerian king could invoke. The record is not hidden, it is not esoteric, it has simply been sitting in the trays, carefully wrapped, patiently waiting. What exactly was here is a question the Sumerians themselves appear not to have answered, directly, or if they did, those tablets have not survived. What remains are the outlines, the shadows of a prior world, pressed into clay by people who took great care to remember what they had been told. Perhaps tonight is a good time to start reading those shadows. Wherever you are right now, whether you are lying in bed with the lights already low, or sitting somewhere quiet at the edge of the day, take a moment and comment where you listening from, the stillness around you. Now imagine this, the land between the rivers. To understand what is written on the tablets, you first need to understand who was writing, and why their testimony across all its strangeness and distance deserves to be taken seriously. The Sumerians emerge into the archaeological record in the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, a flat, fertile corridor of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southeastern Iraq, sometime around 4500 BC. The environment they inhabited was not at first glance an obvious cradle for civilization. The plain is almost without natural resources in the conventional sense. No stone, no timber, no metal, or within accessible distance. The climate is extreme, with summer temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius and a wind that carries fine dust for weeks at a time. Flooding from the two great rivers was irregular and often catastrophic, and yet what the southern Mesopotamian plain possessed in extraordinary abundance was water, silt, and an entirely flat surface amenable to irrigation. The Sumerians were among the first people in the archaeological record to develop large-scale irrigation agriculture, the controlled channeling of river water across cultivated fields. And this single technological achievement produced agricultural surpluses large enough to free a significant portion of the population from food production entirely. Those freed hands became potters, metal workers, weavers, merchants, scribes, priests, skuvers, and administrators. The surplus became a city, the city they built first, or at least the city their own texts consistently name as the first, was Eridu. Eridu sits today as a low mound of crumbled mud brick in the Iraqi desert, roughly 20 kilometers southwest of the ancient city. Of its modern name is Tel Abu Shahin. British Vice-Consul John George Taylor conducted the first tentative excavations there in 1855, finding traces of a building he could not immediately identify. But it was the excavation led by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and his British colleague Satan Lloyd beginning in 1946 and continuing into the early 1950s that revealed the full significance of the site. Beneath the mound at Eridu, Safar and Lloyd uncovered 18 successive layers of temple, construction built directly atop one another, across an unbroken sequence stretching from the early Ubade period, approximately 5400 BCE, through the late Euro period, nearly 2,000 years of continuous religious activity at the Kea, same sacred spot. The earliest layer temple-level sphere was a single small room, a mud brick platform, a niche in one wall, possibly for a cult statue, a scatter of fish bones on the floor, offerings almost certainly to the god, believed to reside in the primordial waters beneath the earth. That god was Enki, whose domain was the freshwater ocean the Sumerians called the Absu. Eridu was in every textual source that mentions it, the city of Enki, and the Sumerian king list, a remarkable document we will examine in detail later, opens with the declaration that kingship descended from heaven and first came to rest at Eridu. From that beginning, Sumerian civilization expanded along the river system over the next 4 millennia in a pattern that archaeologists have traced through pottery sequences, administrative documents, and the progressive development of urban settlement. By 3400 BC, the city of Uruk, ancient seat of the sky god An, and later, the legendary home of Gilgamesh, had grown into what may have been the largest city on Earth, with a population estimated between 25,000 and 50,000 people. It was at Uro, in the period archaeologists called the Late Europe, that the first Cana form. Tablets appear small clay rectangles, impressed with a reed stylus, initially recording nothing more literary than accounts of grain and livestock, but constituting nonetheless the earliest surviving written records produced by any human civilization. Those early tablets were administrative, practical. They were the paperwork of a complex urban economy, managing temple storehouses, tracking the movement of goods, recording the output of workers, and the obligations of households. But the technology of writing once developed was not long confined to the counting of barley. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, Sumerian scribes were inscribing hymns, myths, lamentations, wisdom texts, king lists, and god catalogues onto clay tablets that were copied, stored, and distributed across the major temple complexes of the southern plain. The great temple schools, known as the Aduba, literally tablet houses, trained generations of scribes not only in the mechanics of cuneiform, but in the entire literary and religious tradition of Sumerian civilization. Students copied texts by hand, over and over again, producing multiple tablet versions of the same composition that have since allowed modern scholars to reconstruct damaged passages by comparing copies. This is the preservation system that delivered the texts we will be examining tonight across 4,000 years to the researchers who would eventually find them. Not oral memory alone, though that played its role, but a deliberate, institutionalized, academically organized system of physical record-keeping maintained by people who understood that written clay was more permanent than the memory of any single generation. That understanding is itself worth pausing over for a moment. The Sumerians produced written civilization not because they were unusually brilliant in some abstract sense, but because the conditions of their environment, the need to manage complex irrigation systems, to track the outputs of diversified urban economies, to coordinate religious rituals across dozens of city-states, demanded administrative precision of a kind that could not be maintained in the head alone. They built a writing system to preserve what they knew, and what they chose to preserve, alongside the grain tallies and the land sale receipts, were texts about the nature of existence itself, about how the world began, about who had been here before them. The Sumerian cities that produce the major textual traditions examined in this investigation include Eridu, Nippur, Uruk, Shurapakara, Abu Salabik, and Lagash. Each site has been excavated by teams from various national institutions over the last century and a half, and together they have yielded hundreds of thousands of individual clay tablet fragments now distributed across museum collections worldwide. The British Museum in London, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Louvre in Paris, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, the Yale Babylonian Collection, and many others. It is from these collections that the evidence for what follows has been drawn, not from private collections of uncertain provenance, not from texts whose authenticity is debated, not from the imaginative reconstructions of popular writers who could not read the original language, from tablets dug from the ground by professional archaeologists, catalogued by professional curators, translated by professional philologists working in an academic tradition that stretches back to the 1840s. The Sumerians were record-keepers of exceptional diligence. That diligence is the reason this investigation is possible at all, and it is what makes the question they left unanswered so striking. They told us about the gods who ruled their world. They named them, ranked them, catalogued their attributes and relationships, recorded their mythological histories, with a thoroughness unmatched in the ancient world. But within that same meticulous record, they also told us consistently, in multiple, independent sources across centuries, that before those gods, there had been something else. They were remarkably reluctant to say exactly what the language of wedges, how the tablets, speak. Before you can trust the evidence, you need to understand the channel through which it was transmitted. That channel is cuneiform, the world's oldest surviving writing system, and its history of decipherment is itself a story that has direct bearing on how reliable the translations used in this investigation actually are. Cuneiform is not an alphabet. It does not represent individual sounds in the way that the letters of English represent sounds. It is a logosyllabic system, a combination of epigraphic signs that represent whole words, or concepts, and phonetic signs that represent syllables developed incrementally from a set of pictographic accounting tokens used in Mesopotamian temples as early as 3500 BCE. The name comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, the characteristic shape of the marks, produced when a cut reed stylus is pressed at an angle into wet clay. Over the course of roughly 3,000 years of active use, from approximately 3100 BC to the 1st century CE, cuneiform was adapted to write at least 15 different languages, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Elamite, Hittite, Huron, and Ugaritic. The Sumerian language, which the script was originally developed to represent, is a language isolate. It has no known relatives. No other language on Earth, living or dead, has been convincingly identified as related to Sumerian, which means that its decipherment could not rely on comparison with known language families in the way that Egyptian hieroglyphics benefited from the existence of Coptic. Cuneiform fell out of use gradually after the conquest of Mesopotamia by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, and the last known cuneiform tablet was inscribed around 75. The knowledge of how to read it died with the last generation of scribes trained in the old temple schools. For nearly 2,000 years, the contents of the hundreds of thousands of tablets scattered across the ruins of Mesopotamian cities were entirely inaccessible. The recovery began tentatively in the early 19th century. Georg Friedrich Gautfend, a German schoolteacher with no formal training in ancient languages, made the first successful decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform in 1802 correctly, identifying the names of several Amanid kings from the Behest inscription. His method was essentially logical rather than linguistic. He reasoned from the structure of royal titles to probable names and verified those names against the classical sources. His work was fragmentary and incomplete, but it opened a door. The door was pushed wide open by Henry Creswick Rowlinson, a British Army officer stationed in Persia in the 1830s and 1840s, who in one of the more remarkable acts of scholarly courage in the history of any discipline, rappelled down a cliff face at Behistun, in what is now western Iran, to copy a massive trilingual royal inscription, Old Persian, Elilumite, and Babylonian, carved into a rock face 80 meters above the road. His complete copying and subsequent decipherment of the Babylonian version of the Behistun inscription published in 1851 gave scholars access to Akkadian cuneiform, the language of the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. But Sumerian, the older, stranger, linguistically isolated language that underlies most of the text discussed in this investigation, proved far more difficult. Edward Hincks, an Irish clergyman who also played a crucial role in deciphering Akkadian, had noticed by the 1850s that the cuneiform system contained signs that could not be explained by Akkadian phonology alone, and proposed the existence of an earlier language he called Sumerian. Confirmation came through the excavations at Nipper, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1889 and 1900, led in part by Herman Hilpry, which unearthed tens of thousands of tablets in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Many of them, school tablets, lexical lists, and bilingual glossaries that the ancient Babylonians themselves had compiled to help their face corps learn the older language. Those bilingual texts proved to be the equivalent of a Rosetta Stone for Sumerian. By working from known Akkadian meanings to their Sumerian equivalents, scholars could reconstruct the language word by word. By the early 20th century, the scholarly framework for reading Sumerian was firmly established. It has been refined continuously since then, and today, the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature developed at the University of Oxford provides freely available transliterations and translations of over 400 Sumerian literary texts, cross-referenced with the physical tablets from which they derive. The translations cited in this investigation draw on this mainstream scholarly tradition. The god lists are a particularly important genre within this tradition. They are neither myths, nor hymns, nor administrative documents. They are systematic catalogues organized in hierarchical and sometimes genealogical order that record the names, epithets, relationships, and attributes of divine beings as the Mesopotamian scribal tradition understood them. God lists were produced over a period of roughly 2,000 years, from the earliest examples at Farah and Abu Salabik in the early dynastic period, roughly 2600 to 2500 BC, through the great canonical compilations of the Neo-Assyrian period in the 7th century BC. The two sites of Farah and Abu Salabik are critical to this investigation. Farah, the ancient city of Uruppak, is located in what is now central Iraq, and its tablets, excavated by a German expedition under Robert Coldway between 1902 and 1903, and by an American expedition in 1931, date to the period roughly between 1600 to 2500 BCE, making them among the oldest substantial literary archives known. Abu Salabik, located nearby, yielded a parallel set of early dynastic tablets excavated by an American team in the 1960s and 1970s under the direction of James Nudstad. Together, these two sites provide the earliest written evidence for the traditions examined. In Predate, this script. What those earliest godless reveal is this. At the top of the divine hierarchy, at the point where all divine genealogy converges, there appear not the familiar great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, but a set of paired beings whose names translate as abstract primordial concepts. And among those pairs appearing already in the Farah and Abu Salabik lists from the very dawn of Sumerian writing is the couple designated Enki and Ninki, not the famous god of wisdom whose temple stood at Eridu, but an earlier, more fundamental pair whose names simply mean Lord Earth and Lady Earth. These are the oldest beings the Sumerian writing system records. Older the texts are clear than Enlil, older by implication than the Anunnaki who carry Enlil's decrees. The word pressed into clay at Farah before 2500 BC by a scribe who learned to write in a tradition that was already centuries old when he first held a reed stylus. That word points backward into a darkness. The Sumerians themselves apparently could not fully illuminate, but they kept pointing to it anyway before the great gods were named. There is a technical term in Assyriology for the group of beings under investigation. They are called, depending on the scholar, either the ancestors of Enlil or the Enki-Ninki deities, the latter name derived from the male-female pair that always opens their enumeration. The term used in the original Sumerian is a plural form based on their names, roughly translatable as the Enkis and the Ninkis. Wilfred G. Lambert, one of the most eminent Assyriologists of the 20th century and the author of the foundational Babylonian creation myths, proposed the straightforward English rendering, the Enkis and the Ninkis. To understand why these beings matter, and why their existence in the record is more significant than a brief mention of ancient mythology would suggest, it is necessary to understand precisely what their position in the divine genealogy means. In the canonical Sumerian theological tradition, Enlil was one of the three supreme deities alongside An-Skrai and Enki, the god of wisdom and water. He was the executive power of the cosmos, the one who pronounced the fates decreed in the divine assembly, the chief god of Nippur, the most sacred city in Sumer, and the paramount divine authority behind kingship. When Sumerian kings claimed legitimacy, they claimed it through Enlil's favor. When disasters struck, floods, invasions, famines, they were attributed to Enlil's displeasure. His position in the theological hierarchy was as close to absolute as any Sumerian god ever felt, and the ancestors of Enlil are listed as the beings who preceded him. The earliest documentation of this tradition, as noted, appears in the Phara and Abu Salabic god lists from approximately 2600 to 2500 BC. In those texts, Enki and Ninki, the primordial pair, appear already as the foundational figures in a genealogical chain that eventually produces Enlil. By the time of the great canonical god list Analam, compiled in the Middle Assyrian period from older Babylonian sources, this genealogy had expanded to 21 pairs of ancestral beings, listed in Anakhenum, Tablet 1, lines 96 through 138. Those 21 pairs, as scholar Andrew R. George has noted in his 2016 study of Mesopotamian incantations and related texts, represent the cumulative assembly of variant traditions from different cities and periods. They are not all from the same original tradition. The number grew over time as scribes working in different schools incorporated regional variations, but the kernel, the essential figure of Enki and Ninki as the ancestral beings who preceded the great gods, is documented from the earliest period of Sumerian writing and never disappears. From the tradition, the names of these pairs, as preserved in the fullest version in Ananamum, are illuminating in themselves. Each name contains the Sumerian words nin and nin, paired with a second element that indicates a primordial condition or substance. There is Enki and Ninki, Lord Earth and Lady Earth. There is Enol and Ninol, whose second element most scholars read as ancient or primordial, abundance. There is Enmul and Ninmol, Lord Star and Lady Star. Enanan, whose second element suggests the quality of being great or boundless. Enkur and Ninkur, Lord Mountain and Lady Mountain. Enduka and Ninduka, Lord of the Holy Hill and Lady of the Holy Hill. And then, near the end of the sequence, Enmira and Ninmir. The second element of these names, Mira, is translated as countless me, or totality of divine decrees. Enmira, Lord of the countless divine decrees, is described in the myth known as the Toil of Babylon as the father of the gods. His name suggests something extraordinary, that the entirety of the divine order, the complete set of the sacred rules and protocols that govern existence, the me, was originally held not by the Anunnaki, not by Enlil, but by this being who appears in the text as an ancestor of Enlil himself. Wilfred G. Lambert in his analysis suggested that a tradition in which Emira was Enlil's actual father, not merely one ancestor in a longer chain, originally existed independently and was only later incorporated into the longer Enki-Ninki sequence. He acknowledged that direct textual statements to that effect are limited, but the epithet, Father of the Gods, is not a minor claim. This detail is important for understanding the larger picture the tablets are assembling. The MI, the divine decrees, the civilizational packages, the sacred protocols, are described, in multiple Sumerian texts, as having existed before the current divine order, stored in the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and guardianship over them was one of the defining characteristics of Enki. the famous god of wisdom. The myth in Anna and Enki descended CCSL 1, 3, 1 in the electronic text corpus describes Inanna traveling to Edu and obtaining the MI from Enki, a list that includes kingship, priesthood, truth, descent to the underworld, the scribal arts, music, and dozens of other foundational social and cosmic functions. The text implies clearly that these things already existed when Inanna sought them. They were not created, they were transferred. If Enmiara, the ancestor of Enlil, held the countless May before the Anunnaki existed, if the divine decrees originated with beings who predate the current divine order, then what the Sumerian texts appear to preserve is a memory of governance, knowledge, and civilizational capacity that existed before the age of the gods the Sumerians are famous for. Who precisely held these things, and in what form the text resists saying plainly. What they do say through the discipline of naming is that there was a before. It was organized. It had its own hierarchy of beings, and those beings, by the time the familiar divine order came into existence, had gone somewhere else. The primordial waters, Namu, and the world before form. If the Enki-Ninki ancestral pairs represent the earliest stratum of organized divine beings in Hasbin-Leshan, in the Sumerian record, there is yet something that precedes even them. Not a being with an administrative title or a genealogical position, something more fundamental, something the Sumerians named Namu. Namu appears in the Sumerian texts not as a god in the ordinary sense. She has no temple complex of her own in the archaeological record, no regular cult, no hymns to herself as the primary subject, but as the primordial condition from which everything else emerged. Her Sumerian name is most commonly translated as the primeval sea, or the primordial waters, and the sign used to write it is the same sign used for the underground freshwater ocean, the Abzu. The two concepts, Namu and the Abzu, appear to be related aspects of the same primordial reality. The primary textual source for Namu's role in Sumerian cosmogony is the prologue to a literary composition designated in modern scholarship as Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, etc. 1. 8. 1. 4. This prologue, which constitutes one of the most important cosmological passages in the entire Sumerian corpus, describes the process of creation in compressed poetic form. The main tablet preserving this text was excavated at Nippore during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions in the 1890s. The text reads in Samuel Noah Kramer's translation that in the beginning there was only the primeval sea. From that sea and the sky was born. Then Ki the earth, An and Ki united, and from their union Enlil was born. Enlil then separated and from Ki, taking the earth as his domain, while An carried off the sky. The key detail is the starting point. Only the primeval sea before An, before Ki, before Enlil, before the divine order that produces the Anunnaki. There was Namu. She is not described as a creator in the sense of an intentional divine agent, making decisions and executing plans. She is described as the condition out of which creation emerged, a generative primordial substance rather than a manufacturing deity. She gives birth without a partner named. An and Ki are her offspring, and they are the parents of the entire divine order that follows. A further text found on the Eridu Genesis tablet, catalogued as CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection, excavated from Nippur and dated to approximately the 17th century Bast, though almost certainly preserving much older traditions, contains a creation passage in which Namu takes a more active role in this version. It is Namu who alerts Enki to the need to create humanity, coming to him in the Abzu and urging him to produce beings who can labor so the gods may rest. The text describes Namu as Enki's mother, the Abzu herself, which places her not just before An and Ki, but before the entire divine architecture that the Anunnaki inhabit and administer. What is striking about Namu from the investigative perspective this script is following is what she implies about the structure of time in Sumerian cosmological thought. The Sumerians, whose administrative precision in every other domain was exceptional, appear to have understood cosmological time as moving through distinct phases. Before Namu, there is nothing in the record. No text attempts to describe what preceded her. Namu herself appears to be the boundary condition of intelligible existence. Beyond her, the tablets go silent. From Namu emerge Ani. From An and Ki emerged the Enki-Ninki ancestral pairs, who in turn generate Enlil. From Enlil and the assembled divine order, the Anunnaki, the great gods who decree the fates of humanity, begin their work. Each layer proceeds and produces the next, and the layers are not mythologically incidental. They are documented in multiple independent textual traditions consistently preserved across different periods and different genres of cuneiform literature. The Abzu described simultaneously as the domain of Enki, the dwelling place of the Akchalu sages, the origin point of the Mi, the residence of the primordial Enki-Ninki pairs in their post-active phase, and the primal condition named Namu, functions in these texts as a kind of deep archive, a repository below the threshold of the visible world, where the originating knowledge and the originating beings of the cosmos continue to exist even after they have been superseded by the current divine order. Mainstream scholarship, following Thor Jacobson's influential interpretation in The Few Treasures of Darkness, 1976, and the work of subsequent scholars, reads this cosmological structure as a sophisticated philosophical mythology, an attempt by the Sumerians to account for the origin of order from chaos, to trace the genealogy of divine authority to its ultimate source, and to maintain the legitimacy of the current cosmic arrangement by rooting it in a sequence that goes back as far as thought can reach. That reading is coherent and well-grounded, but it does not fully account for one feature of the tradition that scholars themselves have noted with some care. The beings who inhabit these earlier strata are not simply abstract. They are named. They are given attributes. They are described as having been active before they became inactive. The transition from active to inactive is not described as a natural process of philosophical evolution. It is in several texts described as a displacement, a removal, a descent, a departure that left traces. The Abzu does not forget what it holds, the ancestors who went underground. There is a moment in the ancient Sumerian poem known as the Death of Gilgamesh, a poem preserved on old Babylonian tablets from Nippur and other sites designated ECSL 1, 8, 1, 38, 1, 3 in the standard corpus, when the hero, having accepted that he cannot escape death, prepares gifts for the inhabitants of the underworld. The passage lists among the recipients of those gifts the following: Enki and Ninki, Enmul and Ninmul, Enduga and Ninduka, Endora and Nindarima, Enua, the female, and male ancestors of Enlil. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, is described as meeting these beings in the underworld. He is not bringing gifts to abstract concepts. He is bringing gifts to persons, beings who receive offerings the way gods do, who can be communicated with the way the dead can be communicated with, who have a definite dwelling place and a definite identity. They live in this text beneath. This is consistent with everything the other sources say about the ancestors of Enlil. The Zame hymns, an early dynastic composition from Nippur associated with various deities, describe the underworld residents of Nergal in terms that position the ancestral Enki and Ninki there, the big dwelling whose shadow spreads in the west over the Enki and Ninki. Andrew R. George, in his 2016 study of Mesopotamian incantations, notes that the available sources consistently place these beings in the underworld, but crucially do not explain how they came to be there. That absence of explanation is itself informative. In Sumerian literary tradition, major divine transitions are typically accompanied by narrative justification. When Inanna descends to the underworld, there is a detailed account of the journey and the circumstances that brought it about. When Nergal takes his position as ruler of the realm of the dead, the myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal provides the context, but for the ancestors of Enlil, beings who the texts imply were once active above, no such narrative of descent or displacement has survived. Only a single incantation noted by Andrew R. George in his analysis contains what may be an allusion to a myth in which Enki and Ninki were banished to the underworld or fled there and found a new role. But the text is fragmentary and the allusion indirect. The full story, if it was ever written down, has not come to us. What has come to us instead are the functional uses to which these underground beings were put in later Sumerian practice. And those uses are revealing. They were invoked in exorcisms. Wilfrid G. Lambert documented this in his analysis of late Mesopotamian ritual texts, noting that the names of the primordial ancestors of Enlil were called upon by exorcists confronting evil, spirits, and demonic forces. The logic of this invocation is not difficult to follow. If you are attempting to compel a malevolent force to depart, you do not threaten it with the authority of its contemporaries. You invoke something older, something that predates the current order, and therefore holds authority that the current order cannot override. The ancestors of Enlil, when called upon in exorcisms, function as the ultimate witnesses and the ultimate sanction. They are beings who existed before the structure the demon operates within, and therefore represent a power that structure cannot protect the demon against. This functional role in exorcistic practice is not a minor liturgical detail. It indicates that the Sumerians, and subsequently the Babylonians and Assyrians who inherited and maintained this tradition, considered the ancestors of Enlil to be genuinely powerful, not merely historically antecedent, but currently potent. Their displacement to the underworld had not eliminated their significance. It had, if anything, deepened it. They were the ground beneath the ground, the authority beneath authority, the time before time. An old Babylonian tablet, catalogued as CBS 10417 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, Cade Collection. An unfinished Enel lament, analyzed by scholar Paul Delner Nero, contains a passage in which a goddess appeals to Enlil to spare her city from destruction. The argument she makes is striking. She reminds him that it was his own ancestors, Enki and Ninki, who gave him a city. The implication is that Enlil's authority over cities, his right to grant and withdraw city status, derives ultimately from the beings who came before him. His power is not self-originating. It is inherited, and the beings from whom it was inherited are still there in the deep available to be reminded of what was transferred. The tamarisk incantations preserved in 2 copies from the archive of Eba, a Syrian city with deep cultural connections to Mesopotamia, describe the primordial pair in a particularly evocative image. The tamarisk tree, they say, has its roots below in Enki and Ninki, and its branches above in An. The tree mediates between the beings who dwell in the underworld, the ancestors, and the sky god, who presides over the current order. It is a vertical connector between 2 worlds that still exist simultaneously, below and above, past and present, active and dormant. But dormant is not absent. A single incantation text, noted by Andrew R. George, places the ancestors of Enlil not in the underworld, but in the Absu, the same primordial ocean associated with Namu, with Enki, temple at Eridu, with the Abkalu, who will appear in the next chapter of this investigation. The Abzu and the underworld appear to be related in Sumerian cosmological geography, as different aspects are the same below. The depth beneath the surface of the visible world where the originating forces of existence continue to dwell after their period of active governance has ended. The consistency across all these sources is not coincidental, it is structural. The Sumerians appear to have maintained, across 2,000 years of documented literary tradition, a coherent cosmological model in which the world as they knew it was stratified, built upon the residue of prior orders of being that had not ceased to exist, but had become inaccessible through normal means. The experts, the priests, the exorcists, the kings who swore their oaths, they knew where the deep authority resided. It resided below, the seven who came before the flood. If the ancestors venial represent the most abstract and generative layer of the Anunnaki tradition in the Sumerian texts, the primal pairs from whose depths the current divine order was born, then the absolute represents something more tangible, more functional, and in certain respects more troubling to standard interpretations of what civilization is and where it came from. The word Abkalu is Akkadian. The Sumerian equivalent is Abgul. In the most common general usage, both terms simply mean sage or wise one. They could be applied as epithets to gods, to priests, to exorcists, to any figure whose wisdom was considered exceptional. But in a specific and highly consistent body of Koifor texts, the term Abkalu refers to something far more precise. 7 beings who existed before the Great Flood, who emerged from the Absu, who were associated, in form with fish or with men, cloaked in fish skins, and who transmitted to humanity the entirety of what the Sumerians understood as civilization. The names and functions of the 7 antediluvian Abkalu are preserved most completely in 2 related text traditions. The first is the Uruk list of kings and sages, a tablet discovered during excavations in 1959 and 1960 in the ruins of the Sussida temple of Anu, at Bres in Uruk, and published in the series Speti Babylon, text, Al-Urukan, text 2. Though the tablet itself dates to approximately 165 BCE, it is universally recognized by scholars as preserving a tradition of far greater antiquity that had been transmitted through centuries of scribal copying. The second is the BTM Siri Incantation Series, a ritual text whose reference number in the publication series is LKA1146, among other duplicates, which lists the 7 sages in the context of a protective apotropic ritual and provides both their names and their identifying epithets. The 7 names, as given in the BTM series, are Yuana, who finished the plans for heaven and earth; Ruana Duga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence; Emma, who was allotted a good fate; Emma Galama, who was born in a house; Emma Buluga, who grew up on pasture land, and in Lilda, the conjure of the city of Eridu; Utabzu, who ascended to heaven. The text that follows their names in the Bimeri incantation describes them collectively as the pure Puridu fishes of the sea, the 7 of them who control the plans of heaven and earth. Several details in this list deserve careful attention. The first is the claim attributed to the very first of the 7. Yuana finished the plans for heaven and earth. Not that he helped implement plans, not that he assisted in the execution of a divine design. He finished the plans. The Sumerian concept of a cosmic plan or design, the blueprint of how things should be organized, is elsewhere associated with the divine, decrees, the Mi, and the tablet of destinies. The claim that an antediluvian figure, bearing a fishman form, finished those plans before the flood, before the current divine order fully established itself, positions the Apalu not as recipients of civilizational knowledge, but as its authors or completers. The Euro list pairs each of the 7 Apollo with a specific antediluvian king. The first sage Yuana is paired with the first king Ayalu, whom the Sumerian king list calls Alulim, the first king of Erdu, who reigned 28,800 years. The pairing continues through all 7 pre-flood kings and their associated sages, concluding with Utuabzu, who the list notes ascended to heaven. After the flood, the sage-king pairs continue, but the sages are now described as Umanu, human sages rather than Akuru. The implication of this terminological shift is deliberate. The Akuru were not human. The Uric list was analyzed in its modern scholarly edition by Alan Lindsay in 2008, and he noted that the text is clearly designed to connect historical kingship to mythological divine, kingship to root the chain of legitimate human governance in a pre-flood origin that was not merely older than the flood, but different in kind. The kings ruled, the Abkalu advised, and the Abkalu came from the Absu. In the Epic of Era, a Neo-Ablonian composition centered on the destructive god Era and his colleague Isium, there appears a passage that has fascinated scholars of the absolute tradition for decades. In it, Marduk, the great god of Babylon, speaks with evident longing about the 7 Akalu who are no longer available to him. The text reads in a translation based on Tablet 1, line 147, that after the flood, Marduk commanded the Abkalu to descend to the Absu, and he said they were not to come back up. Later in Tablet 2, line 162, Marduk asks, "Where are the 7 Abkalu of the Apsu, the holy carp, who are perfect in lofty wisdom, like he, their Lord, who can make my body holy?" The tone of that question is unmistakable. Marduk is describing something that has been lost, a capacity, a sacred wisdom, an ability to make the God's presence holy that was possessed by the pre-flood beings and is no longer available in the post-flood world. He sent them away himself, and now he finds himself without what they provided. This passage is troubling to simple interpretations of the Akalu as pure mythology for the hard. Reason that mythology does not typically describe its major divine figures as missing, something they used to have. The God who speaks here is not triumphant. He is bereft, and what he is bereft of is the wisdom of beings who came from a world that existed before him and to be whose depth they have been returned. The Sumerian temple hymns offer one further detail in a hymn that speaks of the Abalu in the Sumerian term Abgul. They are credited with having enlarged a temple. The 7 sages, the text states, enlarged it from the south to the uplands, building, constructing, organizing space. The same capacities that Oannes, the Greek name for the first Apalu, teaches humanity in Berassus's account to construct houses, to found temples, to compile laws, to understand geometry. The 7 beings who came before the flood were, according to the texts, the architects of civilization, not its recipients. The oath sworn to the forgotten ones. Approximately 6 kilometers south of the ancient city of Laroche, in the territory of Gu, in Nu, ancient Sumer, a large stone stele was found broken into multiple pieces, scattered across the excavation site that dates to approximately 2450 BC. It was discovered during French excavations in the late 19th century, and the surviving fragments are now held primarily at the Louvre in Paris, catalogued as AO50, and associated accession numbers. This stele is known as the Stele of the Vultures. It is one of the oldest dated historical documents in the world. It records the military victory of the city-state of Lagash under its ruler over the city-state of La in a territorial dispute over a strip of irrigated farmland called the Guadina. The imagery on the surviving faces shows a net filled with the bodies of defeated enemies held by a giant hand understood to be the hand of the god Ningu, and on another register, Eonatum himself leading his soldiers into battle. The text inscribed on the stele is a formal record of the treaty terms concluded after Eonatum's victory. It lists the oath sworn by Umar to abide by the boundary conditions established by the Gur agreement, and it lists the divine witnesses in whose names those oaths were sworn, the beings before whom the king of Umma swore that his city would respect the boundary on pain of divine retribution. The witnesses include Enlil, Ninhosag, Enki, Utul, God, Suin, the mold, various patron deities of individual cities, and Ninki, the Ninki of the primordial pair, the Lady Earth, who together with her consort Enki of the ancestors, stands at the head of the sequence of beings who preceded Enlil himself. She is invoked in a different grammatical form from the other deities in the treaty. As scholar Dina Katz noted in her 2003 study, the image of the netherworld in the Sumerian sources, Ninki's name on the still of the vultures, appears to be understood as a genitive construction, Lady of the Earth, or possibly Lady of the Underworld, in a way that differs from the straightforward or positive form used in other Enki-Ninki references. This suggests that the scribe of the stele of the vultures understood Ninki not merely as an ancestral deity, but as an active sovereign, a being who held proprietorial authority over the earth itself, and therefore over any oath sworn in its name. The implications are worth sitting with for a moment. A Sumerian king in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC invokes a primordial being who predates the Anunnaki in a legal military document of the highest political seriousness. Not as a poetic flourish, not as an abstract invocation of cosmic principle, but in the same clause, in the same formula as Enlil and Enenki and the sun god, the beings whose authority was the foundation of everyday Sumerian civic and religious life. If the ancestors of Enlil were merely mythological abstractions, philosophical concepts, given personified form for cosmological purposes, with no functional authority in the lived religious practice of the Sumerians, you would not expect to find one of them invoked in a military peace treaty as a divine guarantor of territorial borders, but there she is on stone in Ian Utam's own record. Gad Seltz, in his 1995 study, Uniselt Desumemeritian, Status von Lager, a detailed analysis of the divine world of the early Sumerian city, state of Lagash, notes that Ninki's invocation, in the stele of the vultures, represents an isolated attestation in the context of legal guarantorship, different in character from other known invocations of the primordial deity. The formula is not standard. It appears to be specific to this text, suggesting that the scribe, or Furnham himself, or whoever composed the document, had a particular reason to invoke Ninki here. What that reason was, the text does not say, but the structural logic is available. You invoke the oldest authority, the deepest sanction, the beings whose claim to the earth is not derived from divine grants or decrees, but from the simple fact of having been there before the grants were made. Ninki's name means, among other translations, Lady of the Earth. If there is a being who owns the earth in the most fundamental sense, who holds title to it, not by conquest or appointment, but by primordial presence, then an oath, sworn in her name, is an oath sworn before the original landlord. Ian was a practical man. He had just won a war. He wanted the peace to hold. He chose his witnesses with care. The memory encoded in numbers, the king list hidden layer. Among the many tablets that preserve the Sumerian king list, the most complete and well-known is a four-sided baked clay prism, approximately 20 centimeters high, bearing the museum designation, Molia Museum, 1923. 444, commonly called the Well-Blendel Prism, after Herbert Welland, the collect who donated it to the Asholean Museum at Oxford in 1923. The prism dates to approximately 1800 BCE in its physical form, and was likely produced in, or near the city of Lhasa, in southern Mesopotamia. But the tradition it records is older, substantially older. The Sumerian king list opens with a phrase that has been translated by Thoril Jacobson, whose 1939 critical edition remains the standard scholarly treatment of the text as follows. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Urdu. From that declaration, the list proceeds to enumerate the kings who ruled before the Great Flood, city by city, king by king, together with the duration of each reign, and those durations are extraordinary. Alalum of Eridu, 28,800 years, Algaru, 36,000 years, Emin-Luana of Batira, 43,200 years, Emin-Golan of Batira, 28,800 years, Dumasid, the shepherd of Bad Tibba, 36,000 years, Ensipade Zidan of Larak, 28,800 years, Emen of Kippa, 21,000 years, Ubaratu of Shurupak, 18,600 years, 8 kings, 5 cities, a total of 241,200 years of pre-flood governance, according to the Weld-Blundell prism. Other versions of the list give 10 kings and a slightly different total, but the variant most corroborated by external sources, including the account preserved by the Babylonian historian Berosus in his Babyloniac, written around 281 B.C.E. for the Seleucid court of Antiochus I, arrives at the figure of 432,000 years for the total pre-flood period. Berosus' account, preserved through summaries by later Greek and Roman historians and analyzed by modern scholars, including Stanley Mayer Burstein, describes the same sequence of antediluvian kings in substantially the same order, with the same total duration, expressed in Tristanis. Berosus's Greek text, using the Babylonian unit of measure, called the Saros, with 120 sari, equaling 432,000 years. The agreement between the cuneiform prism and the Greek text, written more than 1,000 years, later confirms that Berosus was working from authentic Babylonian sources, not fabricating. The numbers themselves have generated significant scholarly attention. Some researchers have proposed that the reigns represent not individual human lifespans, but something else: astronomical cycles, administrative units, symbolic encodings of numerical significance, within the base 60 mathematical system the Sumerians employed. The number 432,000 in particular has attracted attention because it is mathematically related to several important cycles. It is 120 multiplied by 3,600, the square of 60, the Sumerian base unit called the Shah, and it has been noted to correspond to a specific number of precessional years in the cycle of the equinox is approximately 1,011/12 of the 25,920-year precession cycle, multiplied by 2. Whether these mathematical correspondences are intentional or coincidental is a question mainstream scholarship treats with appropriate caution, but it raises a question that is worth holding. If the Sumerian scribes who compiled the king list were encoding astronomical or cosmological information in the numbers rather than recording literal lifespans, they were doing something sophisticated. They were using a chronological list as a vehicle for a different kind of knowledge. And if the pre-flood period of 432,000 years represents an encoded astronomical cycle rather than a biographical record, then the kings of that period may represent something other than individual monarchs. The Euro list of kings and sages, examined in the previous chapter, pairs each of the antediluvian kings with one of the 7 Upkulju sages. If the kings are encoding cycles, and the sages are the beings who finish the plans for heaven, and who control the plans of heaven and earth, then the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list may be preserving a memory not of individual rulers with biographies, but of 7 distinct phases of a prior world age, each presided over by a different configuration of cosmic knowledge. The flood in this reading does not end a dynasty of unusually long-lived kings. It ends a cosmological era, and the Abalu banished to the Absu by Marduk after the flood, as the Epic of Era records carry that era's knowledge with them into the deep. Scholars including J. W. Lissman in his 2013 study Cosmogony, Theogony, and Anthropogeny, in Sumerian texts have noted that the antediluvian king tradition intersects at multiple points with the cosmogonic tradition in ways that suggest the two were originally more closely related than their current textual form. Separated into different genres might imply, the king list records the administration of the pre-flood world. The cosmological texts record the divine structure that preceded the Anunnaki. The flood narrative, preserved most completely in the Aridu Genesis, CBS Honto 673 Penn Museum, and in the Atrahasis epic, records the transition from one world order to another. The numbers that survive in the king list may be the oldest layer of that transition's memory. Not biography, but mathematics. Not the lives of kings, but the length of a world. Oannes, rising the being from the sea. Around 281 BC, a Babylonian priest named Berossus, who served at the temple of Bel-Marduk in Babylon and was sufficiently well conned to dedicate his work to the Seleucid king Antigus I, wrote a history of Babylon in the Greek language. The work called Babyloniaca no longer survives in its original form. What remains are summaries and quotations preserved by later Greek and Roman writers Alexander Polyhista, Abydenus, Josephus, and Eusebius of Caesarea, among others. Within those fragments, there is an account that has occupied scholars and fascinated general readers since the 19th century. It concerns the first appearance of a being named Oannes. The account, as preserved through Apollodorus and quoted by Eutychius, reads as follows. In the first year, there appeared from a part of the Ithrian Sea, which bordered upon Babylonia, an animal. The whole body of the animal was like that of a fish, and had under a fish head another head, and also feet below, similar to those of a man subjoined to the fish tail. This being in the daytime used to converse with men, but took no food at that season. And he gave them an insight into letters and sciences and every kind of art. He taught them to construct houses, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth, and showed them how to collect fruits. From that time, so universal were his instructions, nothing has been added material by way of improvement. When the sun set, it was the custom of this being to plunge again into the sea, and abide all night in the deep, for he was amphibious. That final sentence carries a weight that might not be immediately apparent. Oannes, the being who taught humanity everything it needed to know to build civilization, it was not a permanent resident of the surface world. He came up in the day, he went back down at night. His home was the sea. His permanent dwelling was the deep, the same deep where Marduk, in the Epic of Error, mourned that the Abkalu had been sent, and would not return. The identification of Oannes with the first of the 7 antediluvian Abkalu, Yuana, who finished the plans for heaven and earth, was recognized early in modern cuneiform scholarship and is now the consensus scholarly view. Oannes is a Greek rendering of the Akkadian Yuana, which is itself the Akkadian form of the Sumerian name of the first sage. Berossus, drawing on the temple archives of Babylon, was describing the same figure whose name appears in the Uruk list, paired with the first king of Eridu, and whose epithet in the Bt Meri incantation attributes to him the completion of the cosmic plan. Berossus's account is particularly valuable because it provides the function of the first Epla, form detailed enough to examine. The list of what Oannes taught is essentially a complete catalogue of the foundational elements of urban civilization, written language, science, architecture, law, agricultural knowledge, geometry, everything. In other words, that distinguishes settled civilized life from whatever preceded it. The traditional scholarly reading of this account treats it as an origin myth, a narrative explanation of how civilization arose, anthropomorphized into the figure of a divine teacher to give it narrative form. This reading is consistent with the literary conventions of ancient Near Eastern mythology and is clearly defensible. But a different reading is also available in the text's own terms. Barasa specifies that after Owan is taught everything, nothing has been added material by way of improvement. Not very little was added. Not only small refinements followed, nothing material. The knowledge was complete. The teaching was finished. If you read this as a historical claim, as the Babylonian priest Berosus likely intended it, working from sources he considered reliable records, then what is being said is that the civilizational knowledge humanity possesses was not developed incrementally over time through human ingenuity. It was transmitted in a single teaching by a being from the sea who came up once, gave everything, and went back down. The Sumerian concept of the Mi, the divine decrees, the civilizational packages stored in the Abzu maps, directly onto what Owanis transmits in Baras. The Mi, as listed in the Mythin and Ineni, include kingship, the priestly office, descent to the underworld, the sword and arrow, truth, musical instruments, scribal arts, and dozens of other foundational social and cultural structures. These are not things humanity is described as inventing. They are things humanity is described as receiving from the Abzu, via beings associated with the Abzu who came before the Anunnaki established the current divine order. The scholar Stanley Meyer Burstein, in his 1978 critical edition of the Fragments of Berosus, argued that the Babylonia was essentially a transliteration of Mesopotamian mythological content into Greek narrative form, rather than a creative invention. That Berosus was not adapting Babylonian traditions for a Greek audience so much as representing them as faithfully as the genre allowed. If Burstein's assessment is correct, then the account of Owanis preserves something from the deepest available stratum of Babylonian religious tradition, the memory of a being from the pre-flood world who delivered civilization to humanity and then returned to the depths. The question the text leaves hanging in the salt air is the same one all the other sources leave hanging. What was he before the flood, and what is he now in the deep? The banishment when the old world was sent below. Something about the evidence examined across these chapters has the structure of a recurring narrative. It appears in different textual genres, across different periods, in different languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, Huron, but it has the same basic shape. A prior order of beings exists. That order is active, authoritative, and the source of the foundational structures of the world. Then something happens. The prior order is displaced, sent to the underworld, banished to the Absu, consigned to a below that is no longer directly accessible to the surface world. The current divine order, the Anunnaki, the known gods, operates in the space vacated by the prior order, apparently drawing its authority from what was established before. This narrative shape is not imposed on the evidence from outside. It is drawn from the evidence itself, and it appears independently in sources sufficiently diverse that the pattern cannot plausibly be attributed to a single tradition that influenced all the others. In the Sumerian tradition of the ancestors of Enlil, the primordial Enki pairs are described as having once been active and are now dwelling in the underworld. Andrew R. George's same analysis of the available sources notes that no text explains how they came to be there. They are simply described as there now, after having been elsewhere before. In the Huron tradition, which preserved and adapted extensive Mesopotamian theological material during the second millennium BC, the oldest generation of gods, identified by Hittite scribes with the Mesopotamian Anunnaki in their capacity as former gods, are described in the Huron language as Carulian, the former ancient gods. They were banished to the underworld by the younger gods. Their Huron designation, preserved in texts from Hattusa, specifically identifies their status as former, not timeless mythological figures, but beings who once held authority and no longer, 2. In the Babylonian Epic of Error, as noted, Marduk himself sends the 7 back to the Abzu after Ra, the flood, and commands them not to return. The language of the text treats this as a loss, something that made the post-flood world diminished in comparison to what came before. In the myth known as the defeat of Enutila, Imara and Chingu, a fragmentary Neo-Ablonian text analyzed by Wilfried G. Lambert in his Babylonian Creation Myths 2013, several primordial and near-primordial figures, including Enmiera, the Lord of Countless, divine decrees, and ancestral figure of Enlil, are described as defeated. Lambert cautioned that the text is likely a late scholarly compilation rather than a traditional myth, but its content is consistent with the broader pattern. The beings who held authority before the current divine order were at some point overcome. This pattern of displacement, prior order to underworld, or deep current order into the vacated space, has a parallel in the Hittite tradition that extends the comparison beyond Mesopotamia. In the Song of Kumabi and related Hittite mythological texts from Hattusa, the Hittite capital in modern Turkey, the oldest generation of gods, is described as having ruled the heavens before being overthrown. Alalu ruled the gods, then was deposed by Anu, then Anu was deposed by Kumabi, then Kumabi was deposed by the storm god Tishub. The pattern is generational, each divine generation displacing the one before it, with the displaced gods descending into a lower realm. The classical Greek parallel, the overthrow of the Titans by the Olympians in Hesiod's Theogony with the Titans subsequently imprisoned in Tartarus, is noted by scholars including Yam Pul as deriving from the same cultural stream as the Hittite tradition, which in turn draws on Mesopotamian originals. The Greek sky god Uranos, whose name means heaven, is linguistically and mythologically derived from the Hittite version of Anu. Cronus's castration of Uranos echoes Kumabi's castration of Anu. The Titan's imprisonment in Tartarus echoes the displacement of the former gods to the underworld in both Huron and Sumerian traditions. The pattern, in other words, extends across the entire cultural sphere that inherited Mesopotamian mythological material. Multiple independent civilizations, Sumerian, Babylonian, Huron, Hittite, and Greek, all preserved a version of the same story. A prior generation of divine or semi-divine beings was displaced. They went below, the current order rose in their place. What that prior order actually was, whether it represents a genuine pre-flood civilization, a cosmological philosophy encoded in narrative, an inherited oral tradition from a preiterate past, or something else entirely, the texts do not say directly, but the consistency of the pattern across this many independent sources suggests that, whatever the original claim was, it was transmitted with remarkable fidelity through cultures and centuries that had no reason to maintain a false memory of the same approximate shape. Something was here before it was displaced, and the displacement was remembered for thousands of years in dozens of versions by people who continued to invoke its authority in their most serious legal and ritual contexts because it was considered relevant. The inheritance left behind the me and the transfer of civilization. There is a Sumerian myth that is less famous than the Epic of Gilgamesh, less dramatic than the descent of Inanna, and less theologically elaborate than the Enuma Elish, but which for the purposes of this investigation is among the most directly relevant texts in the entire corpus. It is known as Inanna Eneni, and it is designated ETCSL 1.3.1 in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. It is preserved on old Babylonian tablets from Nippur and other sites dating to approximately 1900 to 700 BC, though the tradition it records is generally considered substantially older. The myth has been translated and analyzed by Samuel Noah Kramer Benter and numerous subsequent scholars. The narrative is deceptively simple. Inanna, the goddess of love and warfare, decides to travel to Eridu, the city of Enki, and obtain from him the me. Enki, apparently pleased by Inanna's visit, hosts a banquet, and in a spirit of divine generosity, enhanced by divine beer, begins presenting her with me after me. The list of what changes hands is striking in its comprehensiveness. Kingship, the priestly office, the office of End, the high priest king, decisus and ascent from the underworld, the weapon and the sword, lamentation, sexual intercourse, the protective spirit, scribal craft, music, craftwork, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the Kagara hype of ritual specialit, strife, council, peace, the music of the balag drum, the sacred song, prostitution, and in the tavern, the noble art of the metal worker. The list continues for dozens of items. What matters for this investigation is not the list itself, but its implicit structure. Every item on the list is described as a MI, something that already exists, as a preformed package of capacity and protocol stored in the ABZU in Enki's custody, available to be transferred. None of them is described as being invented or created during the course of the myth. Enki does not make kingship, he gives it. It was already there in the deep. The Sumerian understanding of the me, as documented across multiple texts, is consistent on this point. The MI are not human achievements or divine inventions. They are pre-existing structural elements of existence. Wilfred G. Lambert's phrase, divine decrees, captures their character as binding protocols that define how things must be, and they have been, in the Absu Ea, since before the current divine order was fully established. Recall that Enmara, the ancestral being, whose name means Lord of the Countless May, appears in Bay Toil of Babylon as the father of the gods. And recall that the ancestors of Enlil, the beings who preceded the Anunnaki, are associated throughout the textual tradition with the Abzu, the underworld, and the deep. The picture that emerges from assembling these sources is this: the me, the complete set of civilizational protocols that govern every aspect of human and divine life, originated not with the Anunnaki, but with the beings who came before them. The Anunnaki did not create civilization, they administered what had been established before their time, drawing on the authority of beings whose names are listed in the god catalogues, but whose stories have largely been lost. When Berosus teaches humanity letters and sciences and every kind of art to construct houses, to found temples, to compile laws, and then declares that nothing has been added material by way of improvement, he is describing the transmission of the me from the pre-Anunnaki world to the human world. The channel of that transmission is a being from the Absu, a being who, like the Michis themselves, comes from the deep. This framework, the deep as the archive, the Upkalu as the librarians, the me as the Raxbektsiunu, provides a reading of Sumerian civilization itself that is quite different from the usual narrative of independent invention. In the usual narrative, the Sumerians developed writing, mathematics, law, architecture, and the other foundational elements of civilization through a gradual process of human cultural evolution. And at the archaeological and historical level, that narrative is well supported by the evidence of material culture across the Ubade and Uruk periods. But the Sumerians' own textual account of where those capacities came from is different. In their account, civilization arrived. It did not develop. It was given by beings associated with the prior order, who transmitted it through the Abzu into the current world. Whether this represents a mythological encoding of a historical memory of some actual prior culture whose knowledge was transmitted to the Proto-Sumerians, or a cosmological philosophy that frames all knowledge as eternal and pre-existing, rather than invented or something altogether different, is a question the evidence does not answer. But it is the question the Koltebets are asking. 3 ways to read what was written. By now, The body of evidence accumulated across these chapters constitutes a coherent picture, not a proof of any particular conclusion, but a recognizable pattern drawn from multiple, independent textual traditions spanning more than 2,000 years of cuneiform literature. Before considering what that pattern might mean, it is worth pausing to acknowledge the range of legitimate interpretations available and the scholarly frameworks within which each and rests. There are essentially three ways to read the Sumerian textual evidence for beings who predate the Anunnaki, and each has genuine merit, genuine scholarly support, and genuine limitations. The first interpretation is the one associated most prominently with Thoril Jacobson and his foundational work, The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion, 1976, and with Samuel Noah Kramer's lifelong study of Sumerian literature. In this reading, the entire structure of primordial beings, Namu, the Enki-Ninki ancestors, the Aktalu, represents a sophisticated cosmological mythology, an attempt by the Sumerian, priestly and scribal tradition to account philosophically for the origins of divine order, to root the authority of the known gods in a genealogy that goes back to something uncaused, and to explain why existence has the structure it does, rather than some other structure. In this reading, the beings before the Anunnaki are not historical entities of any kind. They are theological abstractions given personified form for narrative and ritual purposes. The ancestors of Enlil are in this view the Sumerian equivalent of what Greek philosophy would later call the arch, the originating principle from which everything else derives. Naming them as male-female pairs simply reflects the Sumerian tendency to conceptualize all fundamental realities in binary relational terms. Their dwelling in the underworld reflects the Sumerian cosmological principle that the past exists below, in the depth, as the foundation upon which the present is built. This interpretation accounts well for the structured hierarchical nature of the evidence, and for the fact that the Sumerian tradition shows remarkable consistency in its cosmological frameworks across different cities and periods. It is the most parsimonious interpretation and the one most comfortable within mainstream academic axiology. Its limitation is that it does not fully explain the functional uses of these beings. The invocation of Ninki in a military treaty, the exorcistic power attributed to the ancestral pairs, Marduk, genuine loss, at the applause's absence, since abstractions do not typically function as legal witnesses or as sources of sacred power that a major god mourns losing access to. The second interpretation reads the material as encoded wisdom of a philosophical or spiritual nature, teaching through the medium of cosmological narrative a set of principles about the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds, between activity and potentiality, between the current order and the conditions that make it possible. In this reading, the beings before the Anunnaki represent what we might call the latent structure of existence, the deep conditions that must be in place before any particular form of order can arise. The Absu in this reading is not a physical location, but a symbol for the depths of consciousness, or the unmanifest ground of being, or the accumulated wisdom of all prior experience. The Abkalu who come from the Absu represent insights emerging from those depths into the manifest world. Their banishment back to the Absu, after the flood, represents the natural withdrawal of primal wisdom once the conditions for its temporary manifestation have passed. This interpretation is supported by the symbolic richness of the texts and their evident preoccupation with the relationship between the surface and the deep, the active and the dormant. It is the interpretation most compatible with the spiritual traditions that would later draw on Mesopotamian cosmological frameworks. Its limitation is that it tends to dissolve the specific historically grounded details of that evidence, the specific tablet catalog numbers, the specific exorcistic functions, the specific legal uses, into a more general symbolic reading, that the texts themselves, with their characteristic administrative precision, may not fully support. The third interpretation treats the textual evidence as preserved cultural memory, fragmented, mythologized, encoded in the theological and literary conventions available to Sumerian scribes, but ultimately recording something that the ancestors of the Sumerians believed had actually happened. In this reading, the stratum of beings described as preceding the Anunnaki represents a memory, however, distorted by time and transmission, of an actual prior civilization or order that existed in the region before the rise of the Sumerians and from which the Sumerians inherited foundation elements of their own cultural and technological repertoire. This interpretation takes seriously the Sumerians' own insistence that the me arrived rather than developed, that civilization was taught by beings from the deep rather than invented by human ingenuity, that the antediluvian world had its own kings and its own sages whose authority was of a different order from anything that followed. It reads the consistency of the banishment narrative across Sumerian, Huran, Hittite, and the Greek sources as indicating that a genuinely shared historical experience, or at least a shared cultural memory sufficiently old that have preceded the divergence of these traditions, lies at the origin of all the variant versions. Its limitation is the most significant of the three. There is currently no archaeological evidence for a technologically sophisticated civilization in the Mesopotamian region substantially predating the Sumerians. The archaeological record shows a gradual development from the Ubad culture through the Europe period, not the traces of a prior civilization abruptly supplanted. If the memory recorded in the tablets refers to something historical, it refers to something that left no physical trace recoverable by current methods, or to something located elsewhere, and transmitted, or to something whose nature is sufficiently different from stone and metal, civilization, that it would not be recognized in the archaeological record. The scholarly community, including the most careful interpreters of Mesopotamian evidence, from Jacobson to Lambert to George to Lisman, generally operates within the first interpretation, while acknowledging the legitimate questions raised by the second and third. The evidence does not definitively support any single reading. What it does support is the conclusion that the Sumerians themselves held a view of their civilization's origins that was not in any simple sense a story of human invention. They understood themselves to be inheritors, recipients, custodians of something they had received from a world that preceded their own. Whether what they received came from a philosophical tradition, a spiritual transmission, a historical predecessor, or something else entirely, that question is at this distance genuinely open. Gonzalo Rubio, in his 2013 essay, Time Before Time, Primeval Narratives in Early Mesopotamian Literature, notes that the very earliest Sumerian, cosmological texts do not attempt to explain the primordial period in the way that later, more elaborate texts do. They simply gesture toward it briefly, almost reluctantly, as if what lies there cannot be described, only acknowledged. At that time, Enki and Nuni had not emerged. Enlil did not exist. Ninil did not exist. The text from the early dynastic period does not explain what did exist before those absences. It simply marks the boundary of the known. Before that boundary, the tablets go quiet, but they mark it carefully, precisely in multiple independent traditions across more than 2,000 years. Whatever was before the boundary, it mattered enough to remember. The world between the records, implications for what comes next. If even the most cautious of the three interpretations holds, if the tradition of pre-Anunnaki beings represents no more than a sophisticated Sumerian cosmological philosophy, encoding the abstract conditions for divine order, the implications for how we understand the Sumerian achievement are still significant, because even as a philosophical position, the Sumerian claim is remarkable. It is the claim that the world as it exists is not self-originating, that the structures which govern it, the me, the divine decrees, the protocols of civilization, are not inventions of the current divine order, but inheritances from something that came before it. That knowledge is not produced but received. That civilization is not built but transmitted. This is not an incidental feature of Sumerian religious thought. It is structural. It underlies the entire self-standing of the Sumerian scribal tradition. When a Sumerian scribe copies a text in the Uduba, the tablet school, he is not recording his own composition or his own understanding. He is transmitting. The text has an authority that predates him, that predates his teacher, that in the case of the most sacred compositions ultimately traces back to the Abkalu, themselves, the antediluvian sages who received the plans of heaven and earth from the Absu and delivered them to the surface world. The scribe is a link in a chain whose first link is not human. When a Sumerian priest performs a ritual, the ritual's authority likewise does not derive from the current divine order alone. It derives from the me, stored in the Absu, the protocols established before the current order in the time of the beings who preceded, even in Lisil. The ritual works because it activates something older than the gods it invokes. When a Sumerian king claims legitimacy, he does so through a chain of authority that runs not just through the Anunnaki who decree his kingship, but through the antediluvian kings and their Apollo advisors whose records are preserved in the king list, and through those kings, back to the beings who before the flood organized the world according to the completed plans of heaven and earth. The entire structure of Sumerian civilization, at the level of its self-understanding, rests on the premise of a prior world whose authority still operates. If the second interpretation holds, if the pre-Anunnaki tradition encodes a spiritual or philosophical understanding of reality, then the Sumerians were articulating 4,000 years before Western philosophy arrived at four comparable ideas. Something like a doctrine of the primacy of latent or potent being over manifest or active being. The Absu as the source of the me, the deep as the archive of what the surface world draws from without exhausting, the beings who dwell in the depths as the permanent ground of the temporary order above. The Abkalu, who return to the Absu, are not lost, they are receded. The knowledge they carried is not gone. It is held below in the original repository, available in principle to be accessed again, as Marduk himself longed to access it after the flood, when the current world had already begun to show the limitations of its post-flood inheritance. If the third interpretation holds, if the Sumerian tradition of pre-Anunnaki beings preserves a fragmented memory of something historically real, then the implications are of a different and more uncomfortable kind. They suggest that the origin of Sumerian civilization is not where the conventional narrative places it. They suggest that the dramatic step change visible in the archaeological record at the Panding, Aquilize, beginning of the Uruk period, the sudden appearance of writing, large-scale urban organization, complex administration, sophisticated religious architecture, and an astronomical knowledge base that the Sumerians themselves could not fully explain. The derivation of may reflect the successful transmission of a prior knowledge case rather than the independent development of human ingenuity. They suggest that somewhere beneath the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, or somewhere in the cultural memory of the people who settled that plain, there lies the trace of an earlier, two-world that the Sumerians did not invent but inherited, and whose beings they never fully forgot, even as those beings receded into the deep from which the Abzu takes its name. The flood in this reading is not primarily a geological or climatic event. It is a threshold, a discontinuity in the record of the world. On one side of the threshold, the Akalu, the antediluvian kings, the seven whose plans encompassed heaven and earth. On the other side, the post-flood world, the Anunnaki, the human scribes copying what they had received, the exorcists invoking the names of beings in the deep to compel the forces of the current order. Between the two sides of that threshold is everything the tablets are trying to tell us, and everything they ultimately leave unreachable, what the silence carries. Come back now to the room where we began, the dry air, the careful shelves, the tablet in the researcher's hand, palm-sized, pale as sand, covered in the meticulous wedge-shaped marks of a scribe who worked in a city that no longer exists, in a language that died with its last literate speaker 2 millennia ago, recording names that were already ancient when the tablet was pressed, the names of things that were before the gods. In the end, what the clay remembers most clearly is not an answer. It is a shape. The shape of something the Sumerians were trying to hold. A contour in the records pressed again and again, in different hands, in different cities, in different centuries, that traces the outline of a world that preceded their own. They called it the Abzu. They called it the underworld. They called it the time before Enlil existed, before An and Ki separated, before Namu had given birth to anything yet. They called it by the names of 21 pairs of beings whose second elements mean earth and mountain, and ancient time, and the totality of divine decrees. They called it the world of the 7 sages who controlled the plans of heaven and earth, and then went back to the deep at Marduk's instruction and were mourned. They were precise people. They counted their grain to the last measure. They recorded the movement of planets across centuries without interruption. They compiled lists of every known divine being and gave each one a catalogue position and a set of attributes. They were not given to imprecision, and yet they left this, the most fundamental thing, the original owners of the world, without a definitive description, without a clear account of what exactly happened at the threshold of the flood, without an explanation of why the ancestors of Enlil ended up in the underworld, or what was lost when the Abkalu descended to the Abzu and did not return. Perhaps they did not know. Perhaps the memory had already become too fragmented, even by the time the first scribe pressed the first god list into wet clay. Perhaps what we are reading in the tablets is itself the product of an enormous distance of time, a signal that has traveled so far and through so many generations of transmission that its original clarity is no longer recoverable. Or perhaps they knew and chose not to say plainly. There are things in every tradition that are considered too foundational to be stated in ordinary terms. The ground beneath the ground, the authority behind authority, the time before time. These are not things you describe. They are things you invoke in your oaths when you need the deepest possible witness in your camp. Exorcisms when you need something older than the force you are trying to compel. In your god lists when you want to record that the current order is not the first, and that what came before it has not ceased to exist. Only move below into the deep, where the reed beds end, and the fresh water meets something darker, something older, something that has no name left in any living language. The Sumerians told us what they could. They told us there were owners of the earth before the Anunnaki. They told us those owners left, were banished, descended, receded into the same depth from which the Mi had come, from which the Akkalu had come, from which the Eridu Genesis says the primordial waters had given birth to the sky and the earth, and everything that followed. What they could not tell us, or would not tell us, or had already forgotten by the time the clay was crude, ready to receive the stylus, is what those owners were. The tablets mark the boundary. They do not cross it, and perhaps that is the most honest thing about them. An ancient civilization standing at the edge of the oldest question they knew, pressing into clay, not an answer, but a direction, before this something. We know it was there. We invoke it still. We do not know its face. If you are listening to this in the late hours, in the quiet before sleep, let that image carry you for a moment. A scribe at a table, a wet clay tablet, a stylus made of cut-reeded, and a list of names for things so old that even their names are abstractions. Lord of the mountain, Lady of ancient time, Lord of the countless decrees. The script, pressed into the clay survives. The hand that pressed it does not, but the direction it points backward into the deep, toward what came before the gods we know, remains as clear as it was the day it dried. The first owners of the earth left their names in the oldest records humanity has ever produced. They are still there, waiting, as the Absu waits below. If this investigation resonated with you, if something in the clay's long memory stirred something in your own, let us know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Every location, every quiet hour, is another signal sent back toward the deep. Rest now. The tablets will still be there tomorrow.